Hello, and welcome to the reception of my funeral because y'all are gonna kill me for admitting this, but here goes. I hate the movie Good Will Hunting. There you go, I said it. It feels a little sacrilegious. Good Will Hunting is considered to be the gold standard movie as far as foster care issues are concerned, and these issues are near and dear to my heart because I was adopted from foster care as a wee young being. This system has impacted my life and my whole family profoundly. It's not like I've been stabbed by a foster parent like our titular character Will Hunting, but I have a life that's been impacted by foster care. So to criticize the movie feels a tad traitorous, but then again, my life experience is a main motivator behind doing this video. I wouldn't ruminate so much on Good Will Hunting if I hadn't lived my life. I want to preface my statements by saying that I'm aware that these are some of the most based hot takes I've ever concocted. I know ain't all of y'all gonna agree with me. People who are foster care survivors will inevitably disagree with me because we're all individuals. That's okay. But at the end of the day, I come not to send peace, but a sword. So if y'all want to beef with me in the comments, it's open. You're invited. But anyway, here we are. In case you haven't seen the movie, it was written by dynamic duo Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. It centers around the titular character Will Hunting, a boy genius who, due to having an extremely traumatizing childhood in the foster care system, has yet to do anything with his life outside of being a janitor. He keeps running around with his South Boston friends, getting into trouble, until one day he's discovered by a math professor as he's doing equations on the wall, and this math professor helps him get out of jail on the precondition that he A, receive therapy, and B, continue to do math problems with him. But Will is loath to accept these changes and opportunities that the math professor is handing to him due to the lack of security in his entire life thus far. Will's attitude begins to change, however, when his friend Chucky delivers this monologue that best encapsulates both the premise of the movie and my issues with it.
No. Forget you. You don't owe it to yourself. You owe it to me. I mean, you're sitting on a winning lottery ticket. You're too scared to cash it in. And that's bull. Because I'd do almost anything to have what you got.
So what's the big deal? What in this moment makes me so uncomfortable? Simply put, it's this idea that has been an undercurrent throughout the entire movie, which is that intelligence is somehow a redistributor of wealth. Will may have been born into abject poverty, but allegedly, his intelligence has the power to deliver him from that. He can get out of poverty, get out of the bad side of town, all because he has the winning lottery ticket of intelligence. This mentality is most clearly demonstrated here, but it also shows up elsewhere in the film.
But you can do anything you want. You are bound by nothing.
I didn't ask for this.
No. You were born with it, so don't cop out behind. I didn't ask for this.
My main issue with the reasoning that Will is sitting on a winning ticket, that he has won the genetic lottery of intelligence that can save him from the endemic poverty of foster care survivors, is that neither intelligence nor poverty work that way. One government source I found from 2002, closer to Good Will Hunting's 1997 release, states, "Youth aging out of foster care do have mean earnings below the poverty level. Youth aging out of foster care earn significantly less than youth in any of the comparison groups both prior to and after their 18th birthday. Average quarterly earnings do grow significantly from the 4 quarters prior to the 18th birthdays to the 8 quarters after it. In each state, the average earnings increases roughly $500 per quarter. However, even with these increases, these youth average less than $6,000 per year in wages, which is substantially below the 1997 poverty level of $7,890 for a single individual." And from what I can find on Google Scholar, youth aging out of foster care today aren't faring all that much better than youth aging out of foster care in the age of Good Will Hunting, okay? Is that because they're stupid? Is that because they're not smart enough to make money? They're not smart enough to get recognized by charitable math professors? No! These financial conditions are a systemic issue that keep people from achieving their full potential and rising from poverty. It's a function of a machine, okay? There are so many reasons that foster care survivors don't rise from poverty, and I will give you a quick smack of these reasons here. Hobbs et al. Finds that those who aged out of care, like our character Will Hunting, are at an even greater disadvantage than solely impoverished youth due to the myriad stressors that come along with foster care and what lead up to it. These stressors prevent them from networking and finding connections. They struggle to save money because, from the start of their adult lives, they're expected to use all of their income to sustain themselves. Youth who aged out of foster care are more likely than impoverished youth who didn't age out of foster care to have children at a young age, be incarcerated, and be homeless. On top of all that, foster care isn't the ideal environment to learn life skills, so foster care survivors can lag behind in their preparedness to transition into adulthood. So the common thread between all these issues is that there are structural problems with how wealth is distributed, or about how foster care fails to adequately prepare a teen for adulthood. These problems are neither caused by nor completely ameliorated by intelligence. Intelligence can't give you an inheritance to rely on, nor can it cure you of all the socio-emotional problems that disadvantage foster youth. Thus, it's a bit of a pipe dream that Will Hunting, simply by virtue of being intelligent and solving a difficult math equation, gets all the support he needs handed to him and then can go live happily ever after. That's just not how that works. That type of meritocratic transaction may make sense in the world of the movie, where there are just benevolent math professors waiting in the wings to scoop up disadvantaged foster youth, but that doesn't correlate to the real world in any way. Where there's no amount of intelligence that can set up a foster youth for the kind of Deus Ex Machina rescue that Will Hunting receives in this movie. Intelligence cannot save a person from crushing poverty. That's not how poverty works in any tangible way. And for that matter, that's not how intelligence works. I mean, we don't completely know how it works, but it probably doesn't work like that. So, Will Hunting's intelligence is depicted as the winning ticket, ostensibly in a genetic lottery. It's an innate, inborn characteristic that other characters treat as incongruous, or at least surprising given his social status.
He's from Southie.
Yeah.
Boy genius from Southie.
Even Will's Southie friends seem to think that his intelligence is too superior for their company, an attitude that was reflected in Chucky's monologue I showed you in the beginning of the video.
Hanging around here is a straight waste of your time.
Will Hunting, the winner of the genetic lottery, has rose above his raisin, and the movie tries to get us to appreciate how odd or even ironic that is. I simply don't jive with that. I think it smacks of haphazardly half-deconstructed eugenicist narratives about the intelligence and the ability of foster care survivors. And I think that the movie, in the long run, contributes to the condemnation of foster care survivors that it is, on its surface, attempting to dismantle. I know that sounds crazy, but for much of the 20th century, the prevailing notion was that foster care survivors were genetically inferior, that we're genetically predisposed to limited intelligence and criminal animalistic behavior, hence why we ended up in foster care in the first place. As scholar E. Wayne Karp writes in the introduction to his book, A Historical Overview of American Adoption, at the turn of the 20th century, the prevailing scientific opinion was that illegitimate children are biologically predisposed to criminality and feeble-mindedness, an attitude which was promulgated by then-popular eugenicist Henry H. Goddard. Interestingly, child welfare activists of the time did little to dispel those notions, instead opting to acknowledge the genetic inferiority of foster children while urging that these genetic inferiorities could be smoothed out with adequate care. Karp cites a child welfare magazine writing, "The Delineator series, which ran from 1907 to 1911, elevated motherhood by emphasizing the power of mother love to overcome a child's hereditary deficits, and urged readers to fulfill their civic duty by adopting children."
This idea is still raging today. A quick Google search will show you a myriad of people asserting the genetic inferiority of fostered and adopted children. This kind of thing can be found on alt-right messaging boards, but it can also be found on official pages for the Institute of Family Studies and similar institutions. So, I don't categorically dismiss the general concept that aspects of intelligence and behavior could be influenced by genes. I think that's theoretically possible. What I take issue with is the assumption that, as a group, foster children have genetically inferior intelligence and behavior. This is a misrepresentation of facts, and it's a prejudiced concept that leads to the oppression of foster care survivors. First and foremost, even though foster children can fall short in educational attainment or test scores when compared to non-foster children, I think it's most plausible that the underperformance of foster children is largely due to environmental factors, not really genetic ones. Even this paper from 1938, full of language like feeble-minded and defective intelligence, acknowledges that diagnosis of mental capacity should not be made soon after a child is taken from poor surroundings, that children who have been deprived of physical, mental, and social opportunity sometimes make rapid strides when placed in a favorable environment.
In other words, the intellectual underperformance of foster children can be more environmental than genetic, more nurture than nature, and this has been known for a very long time, but has been continually buried under heaps and heaps of eugenicist garbage. Even if intelligence were entirely genetic, it would still be dispersed virtually evenly amongst the classes, foster care survivors included. As we discussed earlier, poverty isn't a matter of intelligence, but of systemic disadvantage. We all know stupid people who are wildly rich and definitely wouldn't have gotten into the University of Southern California if it weren't for bribery. And we all know wildly intelligent, impoverished people who are continually forced to use the entirety of their intelligence on their efforts to remain housed. These are the people who can repair cars and refrigerators with duct tape, paper clips, and maybe a YouTube tutorial. Being impoverished isn't really about being smart or being stupid. It's about being affected by the structural inequalities that keep people poor, the lack of generational wealth, lack of home ownership, having to forego educational opportunities or internships for something that will pay more in the short term but less in the long term. So, genetic propensity for intelligence would, in all likelihood, be evenly distributed amongst the classes. This is especially true because intelligence is a multifactorial trait. It's leagues and leagues more complicated than hair color or eye color. It's not controlled by one or two genes that you either have or you don't. It's too big to be controlled or to be pooled in any one section of the population. I think Good Will Hunting occupies a weird middle ground when it comes to these eugenicist attitudes about foster care survivors' intelligence. Sure, by showing a wicked smart foster care survivor, the movie does dispel the notion that all foster care survivors are innately stupid. That's important, and I'll give kudos where it's due. However, the movie's framing of Will Hunting's intelligence is rife with the attitude that intelligence is genetic, and that lower genetic intelligence is tied up with the quasi-racial groupings of poor people, foster kids, and Southie boys. Think about how the movie constantly states, or at the very least implies, that Will Hunting, because of his intelligence, is somehow too good for his friends or for his geographic locale. The supposedly joyful resolution to the film, the happily ever after moment, is when Will drives off to California to be with his intelligent and fabulously wealthy girlfriend, which I fear makes the movie too much about Will Hunting's exodus from the poor people land to which he is, by a fluke, genetically superior, the winner of the ultra-rare genetic lottery. I know that's the least charitable possible interpretation of this movie, but that's how I see it. When I see a foster care survivor who's obviously learned, I'm not surprised that they're naturally smart, even if they're supposedly from inferior genetic stock. What surprises me is that they've somehow managed to invest time and energy and headspace on learning despite all the obstacles they must have been facing in their personal life. I'm not sure, Good Will Hunting adequately makes that distinction as to why it's impressive that Will Hunting is so smart. In fact, the film specifically drives home the point repeatedly that Will is naturally intellectually talented, that he's never really had to work for any intellectual achievement whatsoever, and that he's just a genetic freak.
You can do my outcome paper in under an hour.
Right. Well, I mean, when it came to stuff like that, I could always just play.
Thus, the problem with Good Will Hunting as it relates to stereotypes about the inbred stupidity of foster children is that it doesn't outright deny that intelligence is genetic and that foster children are a subspecies of human generally characterized by their genetically inferior intelligence. No, instead, the movie insists that intelligence is indeed genetic and seems to accept that foster children and poor people at large are at a disadvantage. It's just that Will Hunting is the exception to the rule. He, somehow, against all odds, has the winning ticket that deems him to be the exceptional orphan, as I like to call it. He's almost the Harry Potter, Pippi Longstocking, Superman-like figure who's supernaturally talented despite being an orphan. This type of story is undeniably entertaining to gawk at, but again, it misses the mark. It's not true to the real-life challenges and triumphs of foster care survivors and impoverished people, and in my mind, it's a bit of an insult to everyone's intelligence. Now, when we put together the ideas about intelligence and poverty that we've been teasing out of Good Will Hunting, we end up in a place that's a lot weirder than the sum of its parts. So first, we have this idea that was explicitly stated by Will's friend Chucky, and that was implied by the very premise of the movie, which is that Will Hunting, as a result of his fantastical intelligence, can transcend poverty and every material challenge put before him. The premise of the film is that he could escape poverty and have any of his heart's desires basically at the snap of his super smart fingers, provided he gets over his emotional issues that are holding him back. The entire conflict of the film surrounds Will overcoming his fear. That was his only barrier to success, as his intelligence was always more than sufficient to raise him from poverty. This makes the world of Good Will Hunting essentially a meritocracy, a social hierarchy in which those with the most skill, talent, or virtue rise to the top of the pecking order. This is already a bit odd because the real world, rife with systemic poverty and inequality, is not a meritocracy. Intelligent people can live their entire lives in abject poverty simply because that's where they were born, and it can be really hard to climb out of that hole. What makes the meritocracy of Good Will Hunting really odd, however, is that there's this only half-deconstructed eugenicist tinge to it. The lower class of people are generally considered stupid, the implication being, as laid out by Chucky, that they're too stupid to move up in the social hierarchy and join the good, not stupid part of town, and this stupidness is, of course, genetic. Then, in the middle of that, we have Will Hunting, the boy who lived. The boy who is really smart. This is the boy who is born with fantastical intelligence, the winning ticket of the genetic lottery. This line in the lottery metaphor it introduces is central to the structure of the film. In Good Will Hunting, intelligence for the lucky, few, select poor people who possess that genetic trait can redistribute wealth, much like a lottery. Will may not have a monetary inheritance like Skylar or her Harvard posse, but he has a genetic inheritance that somehow more than compensates for his material destitution, his genetic inheritance. The genetic propensity for intelligence gives him the ability to rise to the top of the meritocracy and be materially successful. I understand that probably isn't the intended message of the film. I really don't think Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were out there reading Henry H. Goddard and trying to create a propaganda movie about the necessity of maintaining colonies for the feeble-minded with strict exit visas permitted for the few poor people who are genetically superior in intelligence, but nevertheless, that's kind of the direction the movie leans. Now, I can hear angry viewers arguing that I've got it all wrong, that intelligence being a redistributor of wealth isn't the main idea of this movie. After all, without the help of a benevolent math professor and a trustworthy therapist, Will Hunting would still be wasting away in Margaritaville. So, it could be argued that the film is saying that smart people exist in disadvantaged situations and need to be given a hand up to help them over the hurdle so that their potential can be realized. I actually do accept that criticism of my argument. That is exactly what the movie is saying, but it exists in tandem with what I said earlier. Intelligence can be a redistributor of wealth as long as social support is afforded to the intelligent, and intelligence is still primarily genetic. To me, that narrative is scarcely less bleak than the previous one. Why? Because it implies that intelligence is a precondition for deserving help, or at least that intelligence and productivity are why a foster youth would deserve support. Our main character, Will Hunting, isn't deemed a worthy subject matter of the film simply because he's a person who exists, who has intrinsic value, and yet has a reduced quality of life because of the magnitude of the trauma he's experienced. No, instead, Will Hunting is deemed a worthy subject matter of the film because he's wicked smart. The very first shot of the film is of Will Hunting's books strewn all over his apartment floor, full of math equations, and then a couple of seconds into this, we see Will poring over them. Already in the movie, Will's intelligence precedes him. It's his defining characteristic over and above his simple personhood. Then Will's intelligence is what makes him a worthy recipient of the math professor's benevolence and a judge's mercy. The entire film is predicated on the idea that Will is deserving of help, not simply because he's a dude who needs help, but because he's a dude who's wicked smart. His intrinsic value, the worthiness that is conferred upon him by his existence as a human, regardless of his intelligence, isn't of much interest to the film. This is the fatal flaw of the movie, in my opinion. The mistake that leads to all the movie's other mistakes. If Will Hunting's intrinsic worth as a human being and his quality of life were the central focuses of the movie's conflict, then there wouldn't have been this need to give him a wild extrinsic value, namely his intelligence, in order to construct the movie's plot. If there weren't the need to give him the extrinsic value of intelligence, then there wouldn't have been the need to assert that he's a freaking nature, a genetic royal flush. Without that, there would be no eugenicist undertones in the film. Then, in turn, the movie's emphasis on the instrumental value of his intelligence over and above his intrinsic value as a person causes it to end up being ass backward about the whole nature versus nurture issue, a debate that's particularly consequential when it comes to foster children. The film's prioritization of Will's extrinsic value over his intrinsic value makes this reversal of nature and nurture necessary. Because his intelligence is what makes him a worthwhile subject matter in the eyes of the film, he has to be intelligent from second one, no nurture required. Thus, the movie ends up taking the position that intelligence is nature first, over and above all. The nurturing that Will receives from the math professor who's getting him into the field and the therapist who's helping him overcome his trauma is helpful for his overall development as a person, but it has no real hand in how smart he is or how smart he becomes. At most, that nurturing only changes how he wields his intelligence. He stops being a janitor and rides off towards the Californian sunset, the land of hope and glory. This may make sense in the world of Good Will Hunting, but then again, it's really detached from reality. Think back to when we were talking about why environment is probably a bigger factor in foster children's intellectual development than genes, and I brought up that 1938 study about how a child who had been previously identified as intellectually disabled jumped up to the average intelligence category after being placed in a more supportive environment. The findings of this study are replicable time and time again. Foster children's test scores increased when placed in more supportive environments. There's a crucial disconnect here. In Good Will Hunting, natural intelligence precedes the nurturing environment, whereas in real life, a nurturing environment precedes intelligence. This is an important distinction because it undergirds attitudes about when and how a child should be deserving of care. Children don't deserve a nurturing environment because they already have natural talent that provides extrinsic value, as is the case in Good Will Hunting. Instead, children deserve a nurturing environment because they have intrinsic value and deserve to live their best lives, no matter how much extrinsic value their lives produce. That schism about extrinsic and intrinsic value and how it pertains to attitudes about nature and nurture may seem trifling, but this is one of the fundamental conundrums of child welfare. For much of the history of child welfare, the children considered most deserving of help would be the children who were most able-bodied and able-minded, or those with the most extrinsic value. The precursor to the modern American foster care system was the orphan train, a scheme designed by well-intentioned but misguided Minister Charles Loring Brace, where orphaned or destitute children from New York were sent to rural areas as farmhands in exchange for room and board. The children who were most capable of work and least behaviorally troubled were the most marketable. The Milton Hershey School, an orphan's home started by the founder of Hershey's Chocolate, only accepted able-bodied white boys without behavior problems, and they were made to work on the farms of the odd company town of Hershey, Pennsylvania. Even in the beloved tale Anne of Green Gables, Anne was originally intended by her foster family to be a boy farmhand, and she eventually convinces them to keep her because she has a different instrumental value, making everyone around her unbelievably happy with how endearing she is, and she becomes a well-respected teacher and whatever. From the dawn of child welfare, children were seen in terms of their extrinsic instrumental value. Orphans were thought to deserve homes because they'd bring in more value than what they cost in room and board. So there's a problem here. Besides the lack of general human dignity for orphans, there's a simple fact that because children need a nurturing environment in order to properly develop intellectually and even physically, it makes no sense that disadvantaged youths should be required to prove their extrinsic value in order to deserve care. Children usually need care in order to develop extrinsic value. It goes the other way around. This notion that disadvantaged youths must prove their extrinsic value in order to deserve care, whatever that extrinsic value be, intelligence or sunny disposition or what have you, is necessarily going to end up denying care to the children who need it most. For instance, the nearly 9% of foster children who have pervasive developmental disabilities. Thus, even though I think Good Will Hunting is definitely trying to make an argument that foster children deserve more care than they get, a point which I wholeheartedly agree with, I take issue with the film's reasoning about why Will Hunting deserves care and concern and the implications that reasoning has for foster children at large. Will Hunting deserves care and support because he's a human being who deserves to live his best life, not because he's wildly intelligent and needs to make the most of it. Additionally, if the movie were focused on his intrinsic worth and his quality of life, there would be less of an impetus to stress his massive earning potential every 5 minutes of the movie.
Will, our offer is $84,000 a year. Retainer.
Will's earning potential, afforded to him by his outlandish intelligence, is how the movie conceives of his ultimate success in the scheme it's built, where your extrinsic values such as intelligence help you climb the meritocratic social order. Money is the external reward for the external merit the movie made his central character trait. Thus, if the movie were more centered around his intrinsic value, the odd ways it bungles the impoverished experience and feeds into myths of meritocracy would have ended up a non-issue. Now, there's a common modus operandi in all the quibbles I've been making about this movie, and it's that I'm extrapolating every moment in this movie to its most absurd possible conclusion. Again, I really do not think that Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were hanging out, twirling their mustaches, concocting the perfect propaganda to promote the most efficient cultivation of genetically superior orphans to use as fuel in the fires of late-stage capitalism. Like, no. Actually, I had to extrapolate a lot of the movie's attitudes out to this huge overarching societal level because my issues with Good Will Hunting aren't with the movie itself, not really. My issues with Good Will Hunting are just symptomatic of issues with society. On the interpersonal level, the movie makes so much sense that I actually was driven to Google if Matt Damon or Ben Affleck had ever been in foster care, and I was mildly surprised to see that neither of them had. After all, Meet the Robinsons makes all the mistakes of this movie a billion times over, and it was directed by an adoptee, so I mean, Will Hunting's character design is compelling. He's a horribly traumatized young person who over relies on his amazing intelligence, which causes him to internalize shame about the abuse he's suffered being his fault and avoid all situations he feels he can't totally control. That conundrum is more than plausible. It's real, and indeed, on days that I'm really in my fields, this movie can be a guilty comfort of mine. The characters and their emotional lives are brilliant. It's the system that those characters operate within, the societal framework of the movie, that at best makes very little sense and at worst is reflective of callous attitudes towards children in care and foster care survivors. It's important to remember that Matt Damon and Ben Affleck didn't really choose that. They're just operating within the system while only being half aware of that system. They ate the purple pill, the center-lib purple pill. The focus on the individual and the exceptional orphanhood are hallmarks of that genre. At any rate, I generally love how Good Will Hunting operates on the interpersonal level, and I hate how it operates on the societal level. In my opinion, this dichotomy is a perfect reflection of narrative conventions of the orphan-crushing machine stories. This phrase comes from a 2020 Twitter post by Pukelblinky, which reads, "Every heartwarming human interest story in America is like, he raised $20,000 to keep 200 orphans from being crushed in the orphan-crushing machine, and then never asks why an orphan-crushing machine exists or why you need to pay to prevent it from being used." In Good Will Hunting, the orphan-crushing machine is the epidemic of trauma in the foster care system, the lack of opportunities in Southie, and the general wealth inequalities that the movie acknowledges without really interrogating. All of these elements work in tandem in a machine that's effectively crushing Will Hunting, who's then rescued by his own otherworldly intelligence and a few do-gooders who really wouldn't need to rescue him if that machine didn't exist. Yes, the individual characters are compelling and sympathetic and we're rooting for them, but the film doesn't make a full and adequate examination of their underlying circumstances. I think Matt Damon and Ben Affleck showed a lot of growth in regards to their presentation of social issues in their most recent co-written film, The Last Duel, a historical drama based around the true story of, you guessed it, the last legally binding duel in French history, which took place in 1386. The duel was meant to settle a dispute between a knight and a squire, wherein the squire allegedly essayed the knight's wife, and then the knight and the squire then had a trial by duel where whoever dies was supposed to be the guilty party as determined by God. 14th century logic. The film itself uses 21st century logic though, and it's made clear that beyond all the he said, the woman actually was essayed. Beyond just the plot, the movie is an exploration of how essay victims are usually treated as guilty until proven innocent and all that. I really don't have any valid complaints about The Last Duel. I thought it made sense. I thought it worked. I think focusing on the real-life scenario helped the movie be inherently more grounded than Good Will Hunting. I also think the knight, the essay victim's husband, was a great morally gray character that Good Will Hunting could have benefited from. The knight isn't a perpetrator of SA, but he is a perpetuator of a system that allows SA to run rampant. His character serves as a window into that system. Good Will Hunting doesn't really have a cognate of that character. It has a victim of a social issue, Will Hunting. It has antagonists like Will's abusers, or more abstractly, maybe poverty itself. It has heroes like the therapist and the math professor and Will's supportive friends. But it doesn't have a really morally gray, probably not inherently evil person who's nevertheless perpetuating systemic oppression just because that's the position they've been molded for within the larger social machine. It has a judge who's kind of like that, but he's not really a fleshed out character and is thus inadequate for the purpose. I think that's a huge shift in the right direction between the two works. That was the linchpin that, to me, made The Last Duel work, and I even think Matt Damon performed it well, but to be honest, he did a stunning job in Good Will Hunting too. I just talked for 45 minutes or whatever about my issues with the film, but certain scenes absolutely robbed the tears straight from my eyes in this movie nevertheless. But anyway, the closest thing Good Will Hunting has to that morally gray knight figure from The Last Duel is, in my opinion, the math professor. At multiple points in the latter half of the movie, the math professor, the therapist, and Will are in conflict because the math professor is insistent that Will make the most of his abilities and stop wasting his intellect, while the therapist thinks that's second priority, the first priority being giving Will the emotional tools he needs to know what he wants and not to shrink from opportunity. You can see how the movie, through this conflict between the math professor and the therapist, is at least starting to tease out the conundrum about Will's extrinsic versus intrinsic value. The professor wants Will to maximize his extrinsic value, to take one of the wildly high-paying jobs he set him up for, to keep solving proofs and join the ranks of household name geniuses. The therapist, on the other hand, is trying to give Will the tools to respect his intrinsic value, to do what he wants, and to find what really makes him tick. That's an interesting conflict. It's what I've been yammering about this entire time. One of my favorite lines of this movie comes as a result of this secondary conflict. The professor is begging Will not to waste his potential, not to throw it away, and Will says this.
Look, maybe I don't want to spend the rest of my potty years sitting around explaining stuff to people.
That's a fascinating statement because, for a second, it illuminates not just Will's reluctance to do math, but his unwillingness to open up in therapy or divulge his secrets to his uptown girlfriend. Will feels there's such a gulf of understanding between himself and other people that it's exhausting and not worth his effort to try and close that gap. While I understand the movie's point that it's unhealthy to avoid opportunities and emotional intimacy out of fear of abandonment or whatever, I appreciate Will's perspective when he says that he doesn't want to spend his life explaining junk to people. The lack of understanding and awareness of Will's circumstances and life experiences, after all, something of an intractable systemic issue. People don't know how the other half lives. Will's life is completely unfathomable to the people who are more privileged than him, and Will doesn't exist as an educational tool. If it exhausts him to explain his ideas and his life experiences, he shouldn't owe that with people, and that's consistent with viewing Will as a person with intrinsic value. His story and his intellectual labor is his to share and his to withhold. That's an interesting line of thought, and it's downright relatable. I mean, when I'm out and about and I hear someone say, oh, Good Will Hunting is a good movie, or, oh, you were in foster care, like, oh, have you seen Good Will Hunting? Like, I just say, yeah, good movie. Do you think I'm gonna get into this spiel? Like, no, I'm not. No. So, we're at a crossroads now. Good Will Hunting is acknowledging, at least somewhat, the oddness of its own premise and the crisis of intrinsic versus extrinsic value that premise creates. I dig that. That's groovy. I think there's a path that the movie could have taken if it were just a tad more careful about that conflict, and it would have ended up my favorite movie of all time, but this is not that movie. Instead, the last word of this conflict belongs to Chucky, who delivers that monologue I already showed you.
You don't owe it to yourself. You owe it to me. It'd be an insult to us if you're still here in 20 years.
Chucky spells it out rather explicitly. Will owes it to him and all the other genetically inferior pores to make the most of his life in this capitalist machine. Intrinsic motivations be damned. Will owes things to other people. He has instrumental value. Will then takes the big fancy job and the rich smart girlfriend and goes off to make the most of himself in California. And that's just odd. Chucky and the professor are making pretty much the same argument. Go be wildly talented elsewhere because I'll be mad at you if you just piddle away something I'm so jealous of. Extrinsic value trumps all here, pretty much unapologetically. Adding to the oddity of this situation is that the therapist has been hounding Will for the last half of the movie, asking Will what he really wants in life. And when Chucky asks Will that same question, he finally gives a perfectly fine, sane answer, which is that he wants to stay with his friends and grow old with them in Southie. We, as movie watchers, are supposed to be disappointed with that answer, but I don't buy it. Friendship is probably the greatest joy this life has to offer, so I wouldn't be scandalized if Will did want to stay in Southie, and I feel it's odd that this movie treats that as a preposterous idea. Will's enjoyment of his life, yet again, kind of seems incidental to the plot of the movie. After all that, you can kind of see how Good Will Hunting is lacking a complicated character to exfoliate some of the deeper issues in the movie's subject matter. It kind of started to do that with the math professor, and then the movie started to be absolutely great, but then for whatever reason, maybe Matt Damon and Ben Affleck thought they were too in the weeds or whatever, they turned that ship around, basically shrugged, and said the math professor was right all along. They gave him instant redemption with a hug from Robin Williams, and that was that. Good Will Hunting opened a can of worms, the exact can I wanted them to open, and then promptly put the lid back on because that was just too many worms. Comparatively speaking, The Last Duel was a coherent and well-constructed movie. The movie and its morally gray characters did a better job at shining a light on systemic social issues, and, that's what makes it so weird to say that I find it boring, and I'd rather watch Good Will Hunting over it any day and twice on Sunday. You see, I watch Good Will Hunting because of everything I've told you today, not in spite of it. I think it's a fascinating glimpse into the neoliberal psyche. I'm watching it and reveling in the quite Horatio Alger villainy of the math professor and getting up into my feels about how cursed this movie is and how the attitudes it reflects have shaped me as a person. This movie is fascinating, even if it's not always fascinating for the reasons it wants to be fascinating. I just don't think other people watch it with that type of disclaimer in mind, so that's why I'm here on YouTube. I will say, however, that there are parts of this movie that are insanely well written and well acted, like when Skylar and Will fight, or when Will has a breakdown at the therapist's office. Those scenes make perfect sense to me, and I watch them unironically. I also want to say that the movie is aware of its limitations in a way that makes it infinitely more watchable than Meet the Robinsons, my actual least favorite movie. The most masterful moment of self-reflection in the film, the most redeeming moment that, despite everything, makes me impressed with the cleverness of the movie is this one.
You're an orphan, right? Do you think I'd know the first thing about how hard your life has been? How you feel, who you are? Because I read Oliver Twist.
Here, the movie demonstrates understanding of the limits of storytelling, the limits of its own craft. Just because you've read a story about the experience of orphan children, or really any experience for that matter, that doesn't mean you truly know what that experience entails, let alone the different individual lives that have been touched by that experience. That's an important thing to keep in mind while watching Good Will Hunting, or really any movie for that matter. I appreciate that the movie makes that disclaimer because it demonstrates actual respect and responsibility towards orphans as being a broad group of diverse people with diverse social experiences that cannot and should not be limited to one movie, no matter how good that movie is. I think that line about Oliver Twist demonstrates maturity and humility, and I commend Good Will Hunting for it. Nevertheless, I think it might be difficult for people to keep that disclaimer in mind when foster care survivors and even adoptees are such a small proportion of the population to begin with. According to the CDC, 2.6% of American adults were ever in foster care. That's about 1 in 50. That's not a whole lot to begin with. That's slightly more than the population of Americans who are Jewish. It's slightly less than the percentage of Americans who are indigenous. It's roughly equal to the amount of Americans who have bipolar disorder, and I meant for that to elucidate things, but I to put it in perspective, but maybe it's more befuddling. Like, now you're thinking about your Jewish, indigenous, bipolar people that you happen to know. But anyway, the point is the percentage of Americans who are in foster care or wherever in foster care is a sizable minority, but still not a very large one. Then there's the simple fact that there's a huge variance in the amount of foster care survivors among class and geographic lines.
Here's a distribution map of the number of kids in foster care by state. You'll notice there's huge amounts of foster care in Montana and Alaska, which is no coincidence because both of those places have more indigenous residents than other states, and due to systemic poverty, discrimination, and the consequences of the reservation and residential school systems, along with just white supremacy in general, huge amounts of Native children end up in foster care. For instance, in Montana in 2020, the indigenous children comprised 9% of the child population, but 35% of the children in foster care. Now, After that, looking at this map, where do you think, y'all, where do you think I'm from? Okay, this is Appalachia, and if I took the time to explain why we're broke and struggling with epidemic levels of drug addiction, I'd be here all day.
My point in showing you all this is to demonstrate that foster care survivors are a small percentage of the population overall, and that this population isn't evenly distributed. There's pockets of foster care survivors in various states and neighborhoods due to systemic factors. This means that theoretically there are people out there in their well-to-do suburbs or whatever who have never really gotten to know a foster care survivor. It's impossible that they haven't seen one if they've been outside their house for more than just the trip back from the hospital, but it's entirely possible that a pretty sizable proportion of the population doesn't have a close friend or an acquaintance who's been in foster care. That being the case, movies like Good Will Hunting can end up being people's only concept of foster care survivors. On one hand, the representation could be a lot worse, and anything that brings awareness to the foster care system is probably a good thing. However, there's a lot of responsibility that falls on Good Will Hunting to make its representation of foster care survivors fair because of how small the foster care survivor population is and how disenfranchised they tend to be. My issues with the movie, in and of itself, have to do with the societal soup it was simmered in and the irritating social attitudes it reflects. My issues with the movie, as it pertains to the position it occupies in the societal consciousness, is that it possibly bears the responsibility for perpetuating those attitudes. If this 2-hour and 6-minute movie is the largest conversation with a foster care survivor that someone's ever had, they'll probably walk away from it thinking, not all the eugenicist and vaguely dehumanizing things that I pointed out in this video, but they'll be thinking about the logical conclusions of those things and all those strains of thought that the movie has and presents and passes off as completely normal because it knows no better. Viewers will walk away from this movie thinking, wow, what an inspiring story. There are actually perfectly smart people who've lived through foster care or extreme traumas and don't end up making the most of their lives and their potential because they're paralyzed with fear and need benefactors to help them help themselves. I think that's an okay takeaway in general, but as I've discussed, it's inadequate at communicating the bigger picture. This story makes sense only on the interpersonal level. The characters and their motivations are easily understandable if, and only if, you take their social context for granted. The minute you actually pay attention to that social context, however, it becomes clear that the movie makes a lot less sense on the societal level. Why does systemic poverty exist? Realistically, how does systemic poverty entrap whole communities who are logically just as intelligent as their moneyed counterparts? What are the actual reasons foster care survivors may underperform intellectually? What type of preventative society-wide care do foster care survivors actually need, rather than just extremely good luck with nosy math professors? I could go on. These are all the questions that Good Will Hunting is hopeless to really answer, and these are the questions its viewers might not even think to ask, despite the fact that they're of prime importance. That's why it's important to keep in mind the movie's own advice about watching movies about orphans. You can't possibly know everything about our lives because you read Oliver Twist or, by extension, watched Good Will Hunting. You can't even really know everything about the interior lives of orphans by watching this video because it's only one video from one inherently narrow perspective. Anyway, if you managed to get through this wildly long video from one inherently narrow perspective, thank you so much. And if you want to have more, please like and subscribe. It's much appreciated, and I'd be happy to have you on my little corner of the internet. So is Valentine. She's here. Valentine. Never mind. She cares more about the window. Bye!